Welcome everyone to this new series where over the course of the next 6 videos we're going to look a little bit more deeply at what is asana, and asana being the movement portion of yoga. So let's dive right in. Now, one of the first things that I think it's always useful to clear up with regards to talking about asana, and that is the fact that yoga is not just asana. So in modern times, what we tend to see is that people think of yoga as being postures and movement. But the reality of the situation is that asana is actually a part of a much, much bigger system that is known as yoga, which consists of many, many other techniques and viewpoints, ideas, and ways of practicing. And so therefore it's really, really important that when we're practicing movement, we try not to think about movement as being the entirety of what yoga is. And one of the reasons for that is that if we think it is simply a physical practice, then it disconnects us from the opportunity to evolve in a way that yoga actually intends for us. Remembering that yoga ultimately is a philosophy and a practice of liberation. Liberation from what? Liberation from our dukkha, liberation from suffering. So that's the first point I just wanted to make, which is that it's important to remember that yoga is more than just asana, and that asana or movement fits in as a limb of a broader yogic system. Now, in terms of asana itself, again, there can be some modern day confusion as to what asana actually is. So if you look at the Sanskrit definitions, then one can understand asana to mean a seat or a posture. Now, what's interesting about the definition that we mentioned first, being seat, is that actually when you look back into ancient texts, we see that really the most important asanas or postures are actually seated postures or seated positions. It's argued by many that it is only over recent times, and when we say recent, maybe the last 500 years, that asana has evolved into a multifaceted system of movement. And so again, we can look at this in a number of different ways. One, we can see that asana are actually a seated postures, and we'll come on to talk about this in another video, is the ability to be able to practice sitting still for long periods of time so that we may then engage ourselves in what are known as the higher limbs or the inner limbs, the internal limbs of yoga, where we practice things like concentration and meditation and absorption, which we can only do if we practice sitting still in comfort for long periods of time. But what we can also say, though, is that in order for us to get into a position where we can sit for long periods of time, we may actually need to do more with our bodies than just sit in order to strengthen them, in order to resolve any tensions or tightness or toxicity that has been kind of creeping into or has been stagnant within the body, so that we can release all of that so that the body becomes stronger, more supple, and then when we come to sit, we are actually able to sit for longer periods of time. Another interesting definition of asana is simply to be, which simply means that we are just here and we are present and we are practicing being present and being really connected to what's going on in our bodies as we are practicing asana. And we're going to come on to talk about that in next week's video too. As I mentioned already, asana is part of a broader system of yoga. And one thing that's worth mentioning here is that if we follow the yoga system according to Patanjali, which is known partly as the Ashtanga yoga system, the 8 limbs of yoga, which he mentions as one methodology of reaching the goal of yoga, kaivalya or liberation, then we see actually that asana is the 3rd limb of yoga. And it comes after some of what we might call the moral or ethical precepts, how we should perhaps behave or engage with the outside world, and how we should perhaps behave or engage with our inner world and with ourselves. And then after that third limb, there are another 5 limbs which then take us into this eventual state of kaivalya, or liberation from dukkha, or liberation from suffering. So again, this is to say that asana is not something that we practice in and of itself just simply for the physical body. And as we'll come to in a future video, we will see that actually asana is something that we practice on a pathway to a higher goal. It's also worth mentioning that asana is what is known as a bahiranga sadhana. It's an external practice. It's one of the external limbs of practice. So we talked about the fact that there are 8 limbs of yoga, and the first 5 are all regarded as more external. That means they're more gross because we're working with the body. And then the final 3 limbs are known as antaranga, which are the inner limbs. And these are the more subtle, perhaps more powerful, we might say, practices that involve the mind and a real deep inner focus and concentration. So it's also useful to see asana in that context too, that it's an outer limb. It's focused on what we might call the outer elements of our system, so that we can bring them under control, so that we can master our energy, so that we can then progress later on into the more subtle realms of practice. That said, asana is a very, very important limb, and in actual fact, it's the way that most of us tend to come to yoga in the first place. So particularly, for example, for me, I found that I started attending yoga classes, which were asana classes. And through those classes, I began to develop a curiosity and an interest in finding out more about yoga, which then led me to reading books and philosophy, then discovering that there are other aspects of yoga which help us to move along the path. So again, I think although this series of videos is going to be focused on asana, it's useful as a takeaway from these videos to realize that actually there is a broader system at play here, of which asana is just a part. One final thing that we can say about asana, particularly in the modern day, is that in some ways it has become even more necessary today than ever. Because of the frenetic pace of the world that we live in, and as a result of that frenetic pace, the frenetic pace at which our mind moves and travels, it could be argued, it could be stated that now more than ever, we need a physical practice in order to really help bring our mind inwards, in order to give the mind an anchor in the sensations that are derived through a proper and correct asana practice, which allows the mind to gradually become more one-pointed and more focused and more concentrated. If we, for example, try to start meditating without movement, if we start perhaps try to do breath work without movement as a baseline before we begin those practices, we may find actually that our attempts to do those things are somewhat superficial, because we haven't been able to, what we might call, tame the body, and through that slightly subdue the mind for it to be able to focus for longer periods of time that are required when we move on to things like breath work, and also when we move on to things like meditation, dharana, dhyana, samadhi practices as well. So as I said, this is the first video in a series. Hopefully that's just given you a little bit of flavor of what asana is, how it fits into the yogic system of Patanjali more generally, and also an understanding of why the practice of asana is something that is important at this point. So I look forward to seeing you again for the next video very soon. Thank you. Namaste.